Good morning. Today is Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. And so I kind of feel it's almost mandatory, I guess, that I should talk about Thanksgiving today, isn't it? But instead of me talking about the individual things that we are thankful for, which is very common and a very worthwhile thing for us to do, it's what we should be doing. I want to talk a little bit today, and I want to remind you what the first Thanksgiving was all about, because I think it says a lot about us as a people. These people that we know as the Pilgrims, when they came to the New World, they landed on the rocky shore of a very cold New England coast in November of 1620. I'm not sure why more is not being made this year of the fact that we are celebrating the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing, but I suppose it's not a politically correct thing to do. But nevertheless, this group of people landed in this very cold, rocky environment, very inhospitable, and they were here right at the very beginning of winter. And so they came at a tough time, but they were determined to make life work in this new world. But it was hard. During that first winter, half of them died. Some of them starved to death. Some of them froze to death. Some of them died of diseases. It was a terrible time. And under nearly every other circumstance in human history, we would look back and say, boy, these were a people who were defeated, who were beaten down. But it's not the case. When they survived that winter, it was the Native Americans who came to them and started helping them in some way, taught them to plant corn and to do some other things, taught them how to fish efficiently. And so they really received a lot of help from those people in those early days, those Native Americans. And so after they had survived that year, they really thought that there was something to celebrate. Much of what happened during that time has been so romanticized that it's hard sometimes to separate fact from fiction. But I want us to start with this reality, and this is the hardest of realities concerning Thanksgiving. It was never meant as a secular holiday. It was a holiday recognizing their dependence and their thankfulness to God. They were thankful to God, so much so that they wanted to have a feast to celebrate that. And so they did. We know that they were indeed helped in lots and lots of ways by those Native Americans that made that feast possible, that made their survival even possible. But we know even then, and for several years, they really struggled to survive. We know that when they came, they had a plan that they were going to delegate everybody with responsibility, and everybody in the colony had one equal share of this adventure. Now, keep in mind that they had been sponsored in coming to the New World by some companies back in England. And so they owed them money. They needed to pay that back. And so when they set up this system, everybody had one equal share. There was no incentive for anybody to work any harder than anybody else. It was a commune system. We would call it socialism. And it didn't work. And during those days when they were struggling with that system, they were not producing enough even to survive on, let alone to be able to pay back their debtors. And so they devised a new system. And every family was given their own plot of land, and every family was then free to do with that land as they would choose. And they set about farming, and they set about producing goods. And they produced so many goods that they were not only able to survive, but they were able to sell those things to people back in England, and they paid off their debtors, and it worked. It was an economic system that these people set up, and it worked. We would call it a free market system. And every individual was given the freedom to do what they wanted and to be rewarded for how hard they would work. And from then on, they thrived. When people in England heard that they were being as successful as they were, then more people came to the New World, and thus this mass immigration began. Now, again, I understand that there are political things today that are being debated, whether this should have been or not, but these people came to such an inhospitable land that it wasn't being used for farming, it wasn't being used for anything, and yet they turned it into something special. One of the parts of this story that has become fiction is the idea that after that first year, they had this feast because they wanted to give thanks to the Native Americans who had helped them. Well, indeed, they were thankful to the Native Americans, but that's not what that feast was about. That simply is not true. They had a feast. And by the way, I'll stick in here, they probably had turkey on that feast, but they also probably had fish and shellfish and fruits and vegetables. But all of this feast was in celebration of them surviving that first year and giving thanks to God for that. Even after that terrible year, and we think 2020 has been bad, even after their terrible year, they gave thanks to God, whom they had come to worship freely. They were seeking religious freedom when they came. This group of pilgrims actually was a congregation of people who had fled England for greater religious freedom, and they'd gone first to the Netherlands, and things didn't work out there, and so they decided to come to the New World. This congregation of people coming, it was a godly group of people coming because they wanted religious freedom. Well, this holiday that we now observe actually was not observed regularly for a long time. Indeed, it was in 1621 that feast occurred, a year after their landing, but it was kind of sporadic, if observed at all, until 1862, when Abraham Lincoln made this he declared it a national day of giving thanks to God. Isn't that interesting? 1862, another very hard time in our nation's history, and yet at that hard time, the emphasis was on giving thanks to God. Well, we go on with the history of this. It was changed in a couple of ways. In 1870, it was made a national observance in a more formal way, but it was not made a federal holiday observed on the fourth Thursday of every November, actually until 1942, when FDR declared it a federal holiday, and from then on we have observed Thanksgiving on this particular Thursday of every November. But we need to go back to the original purpose here. When we celebrate Thanksgiving, just think about what a wonderful thing this is. We as a nation are giving a day to give thanks to God. This, in spite of all the hardships that we experience, we look back at their hardships and ours seem to pale in comparison. We look at what was observed not only in 1621, but what was observed in 1862, and times were really hard, and yet people gave thanks to God during those hard times. And here we are, and we are blessed to be in such a nation that sets aside a day purely to give thanks to God. Too often, and this, by the way, is one of my pet peeves, too often this holiday is kind of overlooked. It's kind of squeezed out in between the silly holiday of Halloween and Christmas. And the reason it's squeezed out, I'm pretty sure, is because it's not commercial enough. Nobody's making a big buck on this except maybe the grocery stores. But since it isn't commercial, it isn't for anything except a pure spiritual purpose of giving thanks to God. So I hope, even in spite of this being 2020, maybe because all the more, because this is 2020, and so much better than 1621 or 1862. We certainly have reason to give thanks to God. Whatever else you do tomorrow on Thanksgiving, whether you have a feast with family or whether you are by yourself, whether you really have what we call a Thanksgiving Day meal or whether you're eating a bologna sandwich, whatever it is, let's observe the original purpose of this holiday and give thanks for the fact, first of all, that we are blessed by a loving God. We also can give thanks that we live in such a nation that sets aside a day just for this. Such a pure, wonderful day, simply to give thanks. And to God, we have much to give thanks. I hope your day is good. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.